Hello and welcome to COM 4740 Intercultural Communication and our discussion of Chapter 1. In this video, I'll cover some highlights of Chapter 1, but please note that these videos are provided so that I can explain certain course concepts in detail and provide examples. However, they do not take the place of the reading. They're meant to supplement the reading. So let's get started. Let's start by talking about what culture is. What have you gotten yourself into taking a class in intercultural communication? Well, when we talk about culture, we often think of it as being a national thing or a racial thing, but our definition of culture is going to explore ideas that are much wider than that. Culture is a set of behaviors and attitudes and beliefs that a particular group of people share and identify with, where they find that they have things in common with other people that they can talk about. So we can think of American culture or French culture, but we can also talk about Western Michigan University culture. We have ways of talking and ways of being and acting here at Western. We could talk about the culture around Christmas in America, or we could talk about the culture around skateboarding or motorcycling. Groups of people who gather around and identify with and share particular beliefs or ways of being in the world are a culture. So since we're defining culture that broadly, we're going to be able to examine a lot of different kinds of cultures in this class, not only national cultures or racial cultures, and we will look at those, but also cultures related to different hobbies and different attitudes and different ways of thinking. We have stereotypes about many cultures, especially if we're outsiders to those cultures. So in this course, we'll examine the process of stereotyping, how we do it, why we do it, and the pros and cons of adhering to stereotypes. We'll also talk about sites of culture, S-I-T-E, which are places where culture happens. Now, these places can be literal or metaphorical. It might be a physical location or, say, a virtual location. So if we say that Western Michigan University is a site of culture, we could be referring to the physical campus, but we could also be referring to Bronco Nation. All the alumni and Bronco fans across the world share a culture, even if they're not in the same place at the same time. I go to a conference every year that's held in a different city, but no matter where it's held, that conference has a certain culture. There's certain routines we do and certain language we use there, no matter what city or what hotel it's being held at. So our goal in this class is to increase our awareness of cultural attitudes, cultural behaviors, and cultural differences and similarities so that we can improve our communication across culture. Intercultural communication is done with these cultural understandings in mind. So we'll learn how to raise our awareness of when cultural forces or issues are at play in our interpersonal communication. With all that in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about this particular course and what I hope we achieve together. My hope is that this class will be a safe place to discuss some issues that might be challenging for some of you, but let's concentrate on being in community with one another and being willing to come to these ideas with curiosity and a willingness to be challenged and explore a lot of different ideas. I'm asking you to sit with these things, turn them over in your mind, and gain a new awareness and understanding of the cultural issues at play in the world around us. In the next series of slides, I'm going to be showing you some cartoons that depict some interesting ideas about culture. This one I've seen going around on the internet a lot, and it kind of addresses the idea of standpoint, which we'll be talking about a lot this semester. Standpoint theory is the idea that we all bring our life experience and perspectives to everything we see and do and encounter, and so we perceive the things differently. The object we're perceiving is the same, but we're perceiving it differently because we have a different perspective on it. So this cartoon illustrates that quite well. The person on the left sees a 6, and the person on the right sees a 9. And neither of them are right or wrong. They're simply seeing the same thing from different vantage points. Standpoint theory uses the metaphor of a landscape and says that we should imagine we're all standing in a landscape looking at hills and valleys and rivers and trees, but we're all standing at different places in that landscape. So if you ask me what is the most prominent feature of the landscape, and I'm standing next to the river, and the river is very loud, I might say that the river is the most prominent feature in the landscape. But if you are standing next to the woods, you might say that the trees are the most prominent feature of the landscape. Standpoint theory also suggests we look at everything through a frame. Imagine you're holding up an empty picture frame and looking at the world through that. And the frame is made up of all the life experiences you've had. So, for example, if you're experiencing life as a white man, or you're experiencing life as a black woman, or as the child of divorced parents, or as someone who's religious or not religious at all, those kinds of things make up the frame you're looking through when you look at your landscape, and they all color the way you see things. Those are a couple of really basic explanations of the ideas behind standpoint theory, and they help to explain a lot about how people can believe what they do. Maybe you have a friend or relative whose politics are really different from yours, and it's really hard to understand how they could possibly see the world the way they do. But if you understood the journey that has brought them to this place and what is in the frame that they're looking through, it might make more sense to us. A good example of standpoint was suggested by an author named Malcolm Gladwell, who's written quite a few books. He wrote one called The Tipping Point and another called Outliers, and a variety of others. And in Outliers, he talks about Canadian comedians and why he thinks a lot of Canadians have been successful as comedians, and why he thinks that a lot of successful comedians come from marginalized groups. And he suggests that since these people are outsiders to the mainstream culture, they have a different view of the things that happen inside the culture. They have an outsider's standpoint that gives them extra insight and the leeway to make fun of what they see, what they find strange, to point out how unusual it is because they're looking at it through fresh eyes in a sense. They're not part of the mainstream, so they're able to look at the mainstream culture in a different way than people who are members do. So that's an interesting example of standpoint, the idea that outsiders make better comedians than insiders do. Here's another cartoon that addresses cultural difference in a funny way. How to be British. On the left, we have a guy yelling, "Help!" And on the right, he's saying, "Excuse me, sir, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I wonder if you would mind helping me a moment, as long as it's no trouble, of course." And what makes this funny is that you have to understand the cultural stereotypes at play here. We might assume that the drowning man in the left-hand picture is an American. Americans being usually quite direct and would just yell, "Help." The drowning man on the right side we might assume is British because their culture is stereotypically extra polite. And you would address someone politely. You don't want to bother them. The focus is more on being courteous. Ideas like that. So this cartoon is making fun of the stereotypical differences between Americans and British in our behavior. This cartoon is an interesting illustration of standpoint because we have these two women who are looking at each other and thinking the same thing of each other, even though the women themselves are very different. And that's because they're looking at each other through their own picture frame of standpoint and their own collection of experiences and cultural beliefs about what is right and wrong and appropriate. So they're judging each other with the same thought, but the meanings are very different in each case. Here's a funny illustration of cultural difference. What is football? If you asked these two teams to show up for a football tournament, what would they be expecting? Language is an important part of culture, and as we proceed through the semester, we'll explore the ways in which understanding the same words in different way can also cause cultural misunderstanding. This is a great illustration of translation versus interpretation, which we will be also talking about this semester. The German word Kummerspeck means grief bacon. But the translation doesn't help us much if we're English speakers. We need an interpretation, which is excess weight gained from emotional overeating. When we have it explained to us like that, then we understand it. It's that moment when you break up with your significant other and eat an entire gallon of ice cream. That's what it's talking about, and we understand that conceptually, but we don't have a specific word for it in English. I like this one with the penguins because we talk a lot about diversity in our culture, and we talk about how we value diversity. I did my doctoral dissertation on diversity, and it's fascinating how people assume it means putting a bunch of people of different skin colors or national origins together in a room. That can be our idea of diversity, but diversity could also mean looking at the uniqueness of each individual, even if those people on the surface might seem very similar to us. So this cartoon is meant to be thought-provoking about how we define diversity and how you enter the world and look for it in the people around you. We can take a deeper dive into culture by talking about academic culture, which all of us are a part of, and thinking about who are the members of that culture and what are their points of view. So let's start with who are the members. Well, if we look at Western Michigan University, we would say students are members of this culture, faculty, staff members, groundskeepers, custodians. The greater Kalamazoo community are also members of our culture here at Western. So we can make quite a long list of people who participate in our culture here at Western. And each of these groups is going to have a different viewpoint, a different vantage point. They're going to be like the people in that 6 and 9 cartoon, looking at the same thing but maybe seeing it differently. For example, a student might be upset because a course that he wants is not being offered this semester, and the administrator might be looking at which courses should we offer this semester, what is the demand, which faculty are available to teach that course, etc. So in this case, both the student and the administrator are looking at the same thing. They're looking at this course offering, but with different interests in mind, different points of view on what should happen. And that happens a lot even within our academic culture. When I talk about this in the face-to-face class, I ask students to write down some things that they wish professors understood about students that they think we don't understand. And it always comes down to the same things. In a class of 30, maybe 27 students, they'll write down, I wish professors understood that we have a life outside of class. And when they tell me that, I say, well, what makes you think professors don't understand that? And then we'll get into talks about the amount of work that's assigned or the scheduling of exams and things like that. And we try to explain our viewpoints to each other and our concerns to each other. Students might not be aware that the professor has a certain number of learning objectives that we're required to meet in the course, and we're required to design assignments that will help us determine whether the student has met those learning objectives and things like that. But it's useful to have that talk and to say, what is troubling you? What is an issue to you? And maybe we can examine it from some different points of view. Maybe I can share my standpoint and you can share yours, and we can come to a better understanding of one another. So with that, I'm going to engage in a little bit of intercultural communication now and talk about some things that I wish students knew to see if any of these resonate with you. The first is, it's all important. It's very disheartening for any teacher, especially one who really cares about what they do, to have a student say, I missed class, did we do anything important? Or I didn't have time to read chapter 3, is it important? This is my career, it's what I do for a living, and to me it's all important, but I wouldn't include material in the course if I didn't think it was worth your time. Also, when you take a course, think about what the word course means. You might run a course or river flows in a course. It's a journey. It's something that goes in a direction, and everything you learn will build on what came before. It's very disheartening when a student asks me if something is important. The next two kind of go together. Learning takes time, and so does studying. Cramming doesn't really work, especially in a course like this where we're examining a lot of new ideas. And it's useful to sit with them for a while and think them over and look around your world and see what evidence you find of these principles. So to try to do it fast is a way of cheating yourself of an important experience. Also, I'm not measuring how fast you can memorize a bunch of vocabulary and regurgitate it on a test, which is what cramming would be. I'm more looking to see if you can apply what you've learned. So on our exams, I'm going to be asking application questions. For example, I might tell you a little story and say which of the theories we've been studying explains what's happening in this story. And then your answer choices would be a variety of theories that we're studying in the class. So you would need to know which one corresponds to the question I'm asking. I'm very much looking for you to be able to apply what you learn in this class. It's not about being overly difficult. It's just about giving it the time, trying to stay on task, keep up with the schedule, and I predict wonderful things will happen as you learn these things and sit with these ideas. They're going to become more and more resonant to you. Also, I want to get to know you. It's hard because I have a lot of students every semester, and some of them will never contact me. My online students who never get in touch might be like the in-person students who sit in the back of the row of the lecture hall and never speak up in class. And that's a perfectly valid way to be a student. That works for many people, but I don't mind if you do want to meet with me, if you want to ask for a meeting just to say hi or send me an email just to check in. I am happy to receive those kind of messages. I spend a lot of time prepping and grading for this class. It's frustrating to a lot of professors that people think we only work a few hours a week and have summers off. I work 7 days a week, and usually I don't have summers off. So even this video I'm making right now, it's going to take me several hours to record it and edit it and upload it. So we do spend a lot of time and effort on the course materials that we present to you. And lastly, I want you to know that I care about you. I care about this subject matter. I care about education. And I really want to have a great class. I want you to learn a lot. I want us to develop a good teacher-student relationship. So I hope that you will enjoy the course. Earlier, I was discussing that effective intercultural communication means that you can communicate effectively across difference. So in order to understand how to communicate across difference, we have to ask ourselves some questions. First of all, what happens when we identify difference? When you realize that you're engaged with someone who is different from you in some fundamental way, how do you react? How do you feel? Are you apprehensive? Is there a little part of you that wants to draw back? Does it make you angry, perhaps, that they can't understand you? Be really honest with yourself about how you react when you identify someone who has an important and fundamental difference from yourself. Another question we have to ask is, why not focus on similarity? You'll hear people say, oh, we're more similar, we're more alike than we are different. And sometimes friends who are different in some important ways will try to focus on what they have in common in order to feel comfortable with one another. And that is certainly a valid approach that we can take, and that approach certainly has merit to it. But I think we do ourselves and each other a disservice when we focus too much on the idea of having things in common, because in that case, we're in danger of dishonoring our difference. An example would be, I'm a white woman, and if I'm talking to a woman of color, I'm sure we have many things in common that we could focus on as similarities. But if I ignore our difference, if I say it doesn't exist, then I'm ignoring and dishonoring the fact that our paths in life may have been different and that our standpoints have been formed in different ways based on the way we're embodied in this society and the way other people react to the ways in which we are embodied. So if I'm focusing so much on similarity, I have to be really careful that I don't dishonor that difference, and that we do acknowledge difference, and that we realize that the other person has had a different experience in life. I'm going to talk about several ways that we can learn about others who are different from us, and these will go on a kind of continuum from, say, worst to best, or the shallowest to the deepest. The first would be to apply stereotypes, and that is probably the weakest way of truly learning about or getting to know other people. One example of this stereotype would be the phrase religious fundamentalists. When I say religious fundamentalists, a particular image might come to mind for you. But again, depending on your standpoint, that image is going to be different for everybody. You might see that as being extreme right-wing political people. You might see that as being very devout churchgoers. You might see that as being people of a similar religion to you or of a very different religion from you. So the stereotypes don't always do us much good because we're all looking at each other through our own lenses. So stereotypes is probably the least thorough of these ways of getting to know about somebody. Secondly, we could observe. That might get us a little bit closer, as in the cartoon we just saw, but observation, again, only takes us so far because we're looking through that lens of our own standpoint. The third way we can learn about other people is we can interview them. Now, this is slightly better and gets us one step closer to a fuller understanding. Interviewing also has its pitfalls, though. There's the issue of, are you asking the right questions? How willing is your interviewee to self-disclose? And there's the fact that the interviewer always has an effect on the situation because your interviewee is always reacting to you and who they think you are. So it's not completely benign. There is that human dynamic going on. The best way we can learn about other people without actually inhabiting their lives, which we can't do, is to be a participant observer. Meaning we actually go and live among them, interact with them, we watch what they do. Sometimes we might wear their clothes, eat their food, practice their religion, and take as deep a dive into the culture as we possibly can. One example of participant observation that many of us might be familiar with is Rumspringa for Amish teens. Teens in the Amish culture and religion are expected to take a year and participate in the outside world to decide whether they want to remain in the Amish community for the rest of their lives or whether they want to disengage from the Amish community. And that period of time when they are engaging in this self-discovery is called Rumspringa. As a participant observer, they get to actually take part in and experience modern non-Amish culture. And these teens are getting to have those experiences, but again, they're viewing them through their own standpoint, their focus, their lens of growing up Amish. So they are not fully able to experience the non-Amish world in the same way as we non-Amish do, but it's probably the closest that we can get to really understanding as being a participant observer. So we've talked about the pros and cons of each of these methods. Is there a best one? Well, it depends on the time and resources you have. It depends on how many participants you have, and it depends on how willing those people are to share their lives with you. In Chapter 1, our authors talk about the 6 imperatives of studying intercultural communication. And we can think of these imperatives as important things or important reasons why it's necessary for someone who wants to be a good citizen of the world to understand intercultural communication. The first of these imperatives is the self-awareness imperative, or the necessity for us to look within ourselves and to really be honest with ourselves about our attitudes and the beliefs and stereotypes we might hold. And some ways of engaging with self-awareness are to understand standpoint as we've been discussing it, and that everyone is looking at the world from a different vantage point and from a different metaphorical place. Another way to increase our self-awareness is to be aware of our own privilege. And privilege is a topic that students in this course sometimes struggle with because they will say to me, well, I'm paying my own way through school, so I'm not privileged, or I didn't grow up wealthy, so I'm not privileged. But we have to understand that privilege comes in many forms, and simply having access to college is a great privilege in this world. So I encourage you to look at the privilege bingo card that is in that supplemental videos and activities folder. It has lots of different boxes that contain statements that would indicate someone was privileged. See how many you can check off and reflect on how privileged you are. If you grew up with both parents in the house, if you grew up middle class, if you grew up with access to health care, never worrying where your next meal is coming from, things like that constitute privilege in today's world. So we increase our self-awareness by being recognized, by recognizing the areas in which we ourselves are privileged. And then the third part of the self-awareness imperative concerns ethnocentrism and Anglocentrism. Let's deconstruct these words so we understand what they mean. Centrism would be centering, right, or focusing on a particular thing. Ethno means ethnic. So ethnocentrism is the idea that your own ethnic group is superior. So something like American exceptionalism might be considered an ethnocentric attitude. The French have a reputation of being very proud of their culture. They might be sometimes accused of ethnocentrism. Any group that assumes that their ethnicity makes them superior to others could be called ethnocentric. Anglocentrism, the prefix Anglo means English, so Anglocentrism is the attitude that Western English-speaking culture is superior. So Great Britain, Canada, America, Australia, parts of the world that speak English as their primary language, that would be Anglocentrism. And if you've ever seen people who want English made the national language of the US, or who get angry when they encounter a menu that is in both English and Spanish, or get angry when a list of instructions is provided in a variety of languages other than English, you might be encountering someone who is Anglocentric, who believes that everyone should speak English and that English-speaking culture is superior. So examine yourself for these ideas and just try to increase your own awareness of where you might be falling into some of these categories. The next imperative is called the demographic imperative, which tells us that understanding the demographic breakdown of the world is important in increasing our cultural awareness. And there are a lot of ways to do this. I've included some videos in the supplemental videos folder that you can watch that illustrate the demographic imperative. The first of these is called If 100 People Lived on Earth, and what that short video does is it breaks down the world into 100 people and then shows you the percentages of people who are white, black, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, other religions, people who have clean water and reliable internet service and access to college. It breaks that all down so it can be an enlightening look at where the privilege in the world is and who the haves and have-nots are on planet Earth. The second thing I've listed here, the effect of changes in demographics. It's important for us to understand that. And here I make note of the Cheerios video. In the supplemental videos folder, you'll find a Cheerios commercial. This was on television a few years ago, and you might have seen it. It features a little mixed-race girl and her white mother and black father just talking about the merits of eating Cheerios. There's no reference made to the fact that this is a mixed-race family, and yet this commercial got a lot of backlash from people who didn't feel that this kind of family should be represented on TV. And we might say that the demographic imperative requires us to keep abreast of what's going on in the world and to know that families like this do exist and are becoming even more common. Is a particular culture more heterogeneous or homogeneous? And these two ideas exist on a continuum. Heterogeneous hetero means different. So heterogeneous would be a culture that has a lot of variety in it. Homogeneous, homo means the same. So a homogeneous culture would be one where people have more similarities than differences. And when you look at this on a national level, you might say that a country like Japan is quite homogeneous. They don't have a great deal of immigrants, and most of the people there are of the same ancestry, so that would be a homogeneous population. If you look at some South American countries that are landlocked and don't have a lot of dealings with those outside of their own culture, we might call those homogeneous. Whereas a culture like the US or others that are more multicultural and based in immigration might be called heterogeneous. So all national cultures fall somewhere on a continuum there. The idea of diversity, and we will be returning to this idea several times throughout the course, that's important to think about. The meaning is dynamic and it can change. So what was considered diversity 100 years ago might not be considered diversity today. Diversity includes factors like age and able-bodiedness and a lot of other traits beyond skin color and national origin. I'm talking about a book here called When Generations Collide. And in this book, they talk about the modern day workplace and how in today's workplace we might have people from their 20s through their 70s. So you might have everyone from baby boomers to millennials and everybody in between trying to work together. And each of those generations has different standpoints and different priorities that can cause them to bump up against each other and get into disagreements. Also, you can end up with someone in their 20s supervising someone in their 70s, which would have been very unusual 100 years ago. So that's a new challenge in the workplace, is having this multi-generational workplace. We are also a culture that emphasizes youth. Youth culture in the United States is valued. We're told we should look young, act young, be young. Older people can be dismissed by popular culture. So think about how age diversity plays a big part in appreciating a variety of demographics. And then lastly, immigration. Think about how immigration is changing and has changed over the years. In the early 20th century, we had a lot of Europeans coming in. We've all heard the stories of people coming in through New York, through Ellis Island. What we may not realize nowadays is that there was a time when Italians and Jews were not considered white. It was viewing whiteness as a social status, not as a skin color. Those groups have gradually come to be included somewhat when we think about whiteness. But understanding how immigration has driven the success of the economy. For example, a lot of Jewish lawyers and bankers in New York took on those professions because none of the bankers or doctors or lawyers would serve the Jewish community or people of color. So when Jews took on those roles and would serve their own people and other minorities, they became very successful. So understanding how demographics have worked through the years will really enhance your understanding of culture. And now, of course, immigration is changing. We no longer think about it so much in terms of people coming from Europe. we think of it more in terms of people coming from Mexico or people coming from Russia or other cultures that the United States has identified as not being like our own. So think of how immigration has changed over the past generation and what effect that has on stereotyping and people's attitudes toward others. So let's take a deeper dive into this idea of sites of culture. You might remember last time I mentioned that sites are places where culture takes place or where people gather together to practice a culture. And here are some that are interesting to look at. Music culture. People who like a particular type or genre of music might develop their own attitudes, their own vocabulary around that type of music. Club culture. If there's a particular bar or restaurant or dance club that you like to go to, that likely has its own culture of the way that you dress and behave in going to that place. We talked a little bit about academic culture. One part of academic culture is sports and marching band. I've included a video in the supplemental folder of the Ohio University Marching 110 marching band, and this video, it's just a couple minutes long, and it really illustrates how marching band can be its own culture. They have their own rituals and own vocabulary, their own practices. An interesting thing about the Marching 110, where there's many more than 110 of them, that's just their traditional name, but they have this attitude about band jackets. You might have seen marching band members often have band jackets that they wear, and there was an article in a newspaper in Athens called "It's All About the Jacket" that was talking about OU's marching band's attitudes about their band jackets. And one of their rituals they had was nobody has a jacket until everybody has a jacket. So when new freshmen would come in at the beginning of the year, the upperclassmen would not wear their jackets until the jackets came in for the new freshmen. So they didn't want to be excluding the newbies. So they had that rule, that ritual in their culture that nobody has a jacket until everybody has a jacket. Sports is a big site of culture. You probably know Red Wings fans or Lions fans or Spartan fans or Wolverine fans or Ohio State fans, and they all have their own attitudes and ways of doing things. And of course, Bronco fans are in that list as well. Medical culture, the way that doctors and nurses and medical practitioners behave with one another and the vocabulary they use together is a site of culture. There's a video in the supplemental folder about an organization in Athens, Ohio called Passion Works. Passion Works is an art studio where people who are abled and disabled can come together to make art together. And it's a way of uniting the community. It's a wonderful organization. And again, it has its own culture. Passion Works is very much supported by the Athens community. They create a particular flower, a big artistic flower that people hang on their walls. And you see these all over Athens, the Passion Works flower that shows your support for that organization. And then of course there's religious culture. If you are part of any kind of organized religion, you know that every denomination has its own rituals, its own ways of conducting worship, its own ways of dressing and interacting with the community around them. We looked at Amish culture and polygamist culture a little earlier. And we could stereotype both of those cultures as people whose lives are guided by religious beliefs, but those cultures are very different from one another. So this is an example of how it pays to take a deeper dive into what is going on inside of a culture before we stereotype them. The Amish are typically educated through 8th grade. There's a belief that any further education isn't necessary and actually could lead you into impure living and impure thinking. So education through the 8th grade gives you enough of what you need to know to get through your life and be a good citizen. Some Amish people practice ordnung or shunning, where if you violate the norms of the community, they will shun you, make you an outsider. They do not use electricity or modern conveniences for the most part, so you will see horses and buggies, for example. And they attempt to limit their interactions with what they call the English, which is anyone who's not Amish. So if you and I are not members of the Amish community, we would be called English by the Amish. And they will interact with the English on an economic level. For example, an Amish farm might sell cheese and butter to other people in the community, that kind of thing. But as far as socializing goes, they mostly try to limit their interactions with the English. So there are some facts about the Amish, who are a group of people whose lives are guided by their religious beliefs. Now let's flip over to polygamy, or cultures where one man might have multiple wives. Well, polygamy has socioeconomic origins to a time when women were not allowed to own property and women were under the charge of their fathers or their husbands. So it made sense for a wealthy man to take on multiple wives because he would be taking on the economic responsibility for those people in the community. It does have connections to particular religions. Polygamous families may have multiple households, so each wife and the children of that wife might live in their own cottage or household. They don't necessarily all live together. And one could argue that polygamy helps to legitimize children of multiple unions in a more formal way where it is legally practiced. So again, here's a group whose people's lives are guided by religious beliefs, but their religious beliefs are very different from the Amish. So that's an example of how blanket stereotype is a very surface level thing, and when you get underneath it, you might find a lot more going on. Another prominent religious culture in the U.S. is the Jewish culture, and if you yourself are not Jewish, you might not be aware of a lot of the traits of Jewish culture. One is the diaspora of Jews, and diaspora means scattered. It means a people who have been scattered. So we do have a population of ethnic Jews who live in Israel, but we also know that we see Jewish communities all over the world. So the Jewish nation, so to speak, has been scattered. That is what diaspora means. There is ethnic versus religious Judaism. Are you born of a Jewish mother, tracing that lineage through the mother? That would make you an ethnic Jew. But there's also religious Judaism. So if you are not Jewish, you could convert to religious Judaism and not be an ethnic Jew. 82% of the population of Jerusalem are ethnic Jews. Most ethnic Jews are also religiously Jewish, but not necessarily the other way around. So there's something to think about. Israeli culture in particular requires public service for young people. After you graduate high school, you usually serve in the army for 2 years before you go to college. It's kind of like taking that gap year or 2 years, but you're expected to serve in the military during that time. Christian Sabbath is on Sunday. Jewish Sabbath runs from sunset Friday through sunset Saturday, and then Sunday is the first day of the week. And businesses often close at 1 p.m. on Fridays to begin the Sabbath. I have an Israeli friend who I met in grad school, and she teaches at University of Tel Aviv, and their first day of the week is Sunday. They have classes on Sunday, which is like their Monday. The Jewish calendar is different from ours, but ours is used for business purposes. So there is the religious calendar and then the business calendar. Hebrew reads from right to left. Business cards are treated as very important. If someone gives you a business card, you treat it as a respectable thing. You don't throw them around or toss them away. You treat them with very much respect. Clothing is meant to be modest. My understanding is that Jewish brides cannot get married in the temple in skimpy wedding dresses. There are requirements for covering parts of the body, and leaving a little food on your plate indicates fullness or plenty. So even though this culture is scattered all over the world, many of these things apply to those different locations or pockets of culture. Another imperative or important reason to learn intercultural communication is the economic imperative. When we think about the impact of globalization on the world and how success in business often requires positive intercultural skills, we can see that it behooves us economically to become good intercultural communicators. A lot of the businesses that you might work for in the future will be global businesses or will have divisions in other countries where you will have to interact with people of different cultures, and anticipating that and learning how to do it well will help you in your career as well. In the supplemental folder, there is a handout of marketing mistakes that's kind of funny about how various American companies have made blunders in marketing their products abroad because they've done so in a way that violates the cultural expectations, such as marketing toothpaste with the promise that it'll make your teeth white to a culture where they chew nuts to make their teeth black, and black teeth are considered attractive. Well, they're not going to be buying a lot of that whitening toothpaste. So that's one example of how those marketing mistakes can be both funny and tragic financially for the companies that make them. Pillsbury is an interesting example of following the economic imperative in their marketing. When they were originally marketing cake mix and biscuit mix and other boxed types of baking mixes in India, they originally ran into some problems because they were focusing on how convenient they are, and they just weren't selling well, and they couldn't figure out why. And when they studied the culture a little more deeply, they found out that in the mid-20th century in India, a housewife or a mother was very proud of the amount of effort she put into her baking. Some of them would even take their own wheat to the mill to be ground into flour. So making things from scratch was tied to caring for your family. So there was this idea that using a mix or taking a shortcut was actually neglectful to your family, or it was shirking your duties as a provider for your family. So Pillsbury took a different tactic with their advertising, particularly in India, and focused on the family in their commercials, and how in this case, the mother would prepare the meal and serve it, and how the family is all around the table together and they're happy. And they would focus on how their product helped to add to this pleasant family experience. They needed to focus there rather than on the convenience and the shortcuts, because the convenience and the shortcuts did not appeal to that particular market. So this is really important if you're in advertising or marketing, to understand the attitudes that underlie that culture. Now, we do a lot of exporting of American culture around the world. A lot of people in different countries and cultures like American things, American fashion, American restaurants, things like that. I have a friend in Belgium who loved Starbucks coffee and could only get it in the airports. They didn't have it in the cities, and it was considered an American thing and such a big treat that they really loved. And she told me about when they opened a Starbucks in Antwerp, what a big deal it was. There was a parade and the mayor cut the ribbon in front of it and people lined up for blocks to get their Starbucks coffee because it was an exciting American thing. So there are elements of American culture that really do appeal to people around the world. And let's look at some of those. What are some elements of American culture that we have exported? What about singing and talent shows that we see on TV? Now, they didn't all originate in America, but we have them, and so do other countries around the world. Like America's Got Talent or American Idol, both of which originated in Britain, but those have been picked up by various cultures around the world. Adventure and stamina shows like Survivor or The Amazing Race are seen all over the world. Beauty and modeling, the Top Model franchise is in many, many different countries. Families and groups, something like Keeping Up with the Kardashians is seen around the world. Creative talent like Project Runway. Game shows like Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, the traditional ones that we all know about. Popular sitcoms in the US are enjoyed in other places. Sex and the City is very popular all around the world. Friends was very popular. How I Met Your Mother, those very mainstream sitcoms here are also popular in other places. And then consumer products like food and cleaning supplies and fashion have also been exported as American culture. The technological imperative requires us to take a deeper look at how technology is affecting intercultural communication. It's increasing the amount of information we have access to throughout the world. It's increasing our contact with people that we would not normally encounter in our daily lives. It sometimes brings up identity issues because we don't really know if the person behind the avatar on the computer is who they say they are, or if they are representing themselves in an honest way. And a really important part of the technological imperative to think about, whether you're in business or in education, is the digital divide. And the digital divide refers to the fact that not every home has internet access. Not everyone has internet access. And we tend to assume that they do. And that's a dangerous thing to assume. I've mentioned before that I went to graduate school at Ohio University down in Athens in the southeast corner of Ohio, right on the edge of Appalachia. A lot of poverty in that area, and the people who live there do not have the smartphones and the computers that a lot of other places have. So in this time of online learning, we make an assumption that every kid has a device at home that they can use for learning. We might assume that if a household has 4 kids, that each of those kids has their own computer or tablet, and that's a very dangerous assumption to make. So we need to be aware of that digital divide. I had a student who was doing an internship at a church, and she was asked to help revamp the church's communication techniques, their communication plan. And one of the things she wanted to do was to put their newsletter completely online rather than mailing it out. And I urged her, before she took that step, to look at the demographics of the congregation, and lo and behold, found out that many of them were older people. And when she polled them asking if they would prefer their newsletter by mail or on the internet, the majority said they would prefer to get it by mail. So that's another example of the digital divide, assuming that everybody has access and that they have the ability and the skill to use technology is a danger zone right now. Maybe someday everybody will have that knowledge, but we're not quite there yet, so we need to keep aware of that. The peace imperative urges us to consider how world peace is affected by our skill in intercultural communication, to ask ourselves whether more contact with people from different cultures results in harmony or disharmony, and if it is resulting in disharmony, how can we fix that? Being aware of issues of colonialism and imperialism, and that not all cultures necessarily embrace the importation of American culture, for example, and consider it an outside force infiltrating their culture. So being aware of how that is seen. Also, pop culture issues. How does our pop culture infiltrate other places and times and other attitudes, to where kids in another part of the world might think they need to wear a particular thing or listen to a particular kind of music because that's what is done in the US, and does that bring harmony or disharmony to their culture? And now we come to the ethical imperative. Our authors tell us that part of being a successful intercultural communicator is paying attention to the ethics of this communication. So we have contextual ethics. Does right and wrong differ in different situations? Cultural relativism is the attitude that we do things our way, they do things their way. Do we say, well, that's the way they do it, and so it's okay for them, but not for us? Or do we say, hey, that's wrong for anybody? Let me give you an example. We talk about universal human rights. In some countries, they might treat women a particular way that's different from the way we treat women. Do we say, well, that's the way their culture treats women, which is the cultural relativism attitude? Or do we say that, no, by our standards, that's wrong, and we're going to swoop in and change it? That's what you have to wrestle with in the area of cultural relativism. The dialogic approach is the idea that we need to actually engage in dialogue with one another about these ethical differences, which becomes a tremendous challenge in international relations. The best way to practice the ethical imperative in your own life is to engage in self-reflexivity. Take that deep dive into your own psyche. Take a look at yourself, your own morals and attitudes. Always be curious and willing to question things and to examine what others believe, even if you don't agree with it.